which is to say to Lenny Henry, listen, you're just not looking at the totality. If you really want to take up this issue, then boy, oh boy, let's do it properly. Saudi Arabia, as I've mentioned, was the great slave trader, going back to the dawn of time. They have lots of money. Let them open their archives. And if we want to talk about this, let's talk about the totality of it. In total, the Barbary pirates took 1.5 million Europeans to North Africa. So, you then get into these stupid, I think, pointless efforts at, who wants to do this arithmetic? And who would get the money? Where would you pay it to? It's just, I think this is a complete dead end. And the final thing I would say about it is the most burning issue is not reparations. The most burning issue is slavery in Africa today. There are perhaps as many as 1 million Africans who are held in slavery in Africa, who are either inherited, bought, or sold. And that is the issue that in my view, we should concentrate on.
Martin Plaut is the former Africa editor of the BBC World Service. He is an advisor to the UK Foreign Office and the US State Department, and he is a senior researcher at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Martin has published extensively on African affairs, and his latest book is Unbroken Chains, a 5,000-year history of African enslavement. So, Martin, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Tell me, why did you write the book?
Well, almost all the work that I do comes from the same point, which is basically my understanding that I just don't know about something. And I realize that there's a huge gap in my knowledge. And I think that is strange. Why can't I find something about it? And I then start working on it. Is one realizes that there are so many things that one doesn't understand. I'll just give you 2 very brief examples. I didn't realize how embedded slavery was in Ethiopia, and that this had gone on almost to the beginning of time. And these were Ethiopians enslaving other Ethiopians, or people who were, shall we say, the people from over the hill, the next door, their neighbors. And then the other thing that was really extraordinary for me was that I came across the Sokoto Caliphate, which I'd never really heard. I sort of vaguely heard about it. It's northern Nigeria in Niger, a huge caliphate, which had 30 emirates in it, lasted for about a century. These were Fulani who came out of the desert and enslaved the Hausa people, and then began trading them, either using them as slaves themselves, or trading with the Portuguese on the coast, or sending them up to North Africa, to the Barbary states of Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, and sometimes as far as Cairo. And I just thought, I know nothing about this. And in 1860, this was the absolute killer fact. 1860, at the time of the American Civil War, there were about 4 million African slaves in America at that time. And you remember that slavery was one of the big issues in the Civil War, possibly the big issue in the war between North and South. And at exactly that time, there were possibly as many slaves in the Sokoto Caliphate as there were in the United States, in the whole of the United States. And I had never heard anything about it. And I thought that was truly shocking.
I think most of us have not heard about things like that. And that's possibly because of the way in which our own cultural leanings push us. The thing which struck me about your book was that it sets slavery in a much wider context. The idea that it's got a 5,000-year history of African enslavement indicates that it's far bigger, far longer, and far more encompassing than merely the transatlantic slave trade, of which we hear about so much and so often. So I mean, it's almost as if we are given a particular narrative to hold on to, while the bigger landscape lies before us unexplored.
I mean, I think that's true. I mean, the first thing I should say and make absolutely clear, I think almost everything that we know in general in Britain about the transatlantic slave trade, just how appalling it was, Britain's role in it, the terrible death rate there was, crossing the Atlantic and in the Caribbean, and the suffering of the people. All that is absolutely true, and not one thing that I've found began to even challenge that. So that's absolutely, must be taken as read. But there is in the academic literature something called the tyranny of the Atlantic. It was a phrase quite cleverly used, because it shows that when you talk about slavery in Africa, there has been such an attraction to talking about the transatlantic slave trade that it has absorbed perhaps 95% of all academic effort has been on it. And there are whole areas of the slave narrative which just have not been explored. And there's some very good reasons for that. I mean, for example, the Saudi Arabian government has decided that its archives on slavery are to be closed. They are not available. Nobody may look at them because it is so explosive. I mean, I can't be sure because, well, how does one know? I can't look at it. But that is probably the reason. It is so embarrassing and goes back so far that they don't want anybody to do any further research. There has been some research, but it's very minimal. And so that, I think, is really concerning and explains why there is so little. But then there's really only one major work on the whole of the Ottoman Empire and their involvement in African enslavement, which was huge. I mean, there were possibly 1.5 million slaves were taken by the Ottoman Empire, mostly from the Horn of Africa, across Arabia, up into the Ottoman area, as far as the Crimea, which parts of which they held. And then there are even examples of African slaves being taken by particularly Arabs who traded with them all the way to India. And I can talk a bit about that if that's interesting, but also then all the way to China. Now, the Chinese did not use African slaves in large numbers. They were trophies. They were things of interest. They were used in Indonesia in much the same way. And there were talks of marriage ceremonies where they'd have sort of a moon and a star, in other words, somebody who was very light-skinned and an African, and it was sort of seen as a status symbol. I'm not talking about large-scale enslavement in China, because the Chinese enslaved their own people they didn't need anymore. It's rather like the Romans only took a few slaves relatively from North Africa when the Roman Empire was in existence, because they had so many slaves from everywhere else. I mean, every tribe and group and kingdom that they conquered, they were slaves. So why do they need any more? There was only places like Sicily they used them on their farms, and in North Africa when they held it.
One thing which was eye-opening to me in looking at your book was that there's also a trans-Indian Ocean slave trade, which I knew nothing about at all, that slaves went from Africa towards India, and that's actually just slightly larger than the transatlantic slave trade. That was a real surprise to me.
It was a surprise to me too. It was the sort of center of my work. But let me be clear, the amount of evidence that there is for this is not small. There have been huge numbers of books written on each of these subjects and articles. I mean, more than you could probably read in a lifetime. The problem is that academics tend to say, well, this is my area, this is my niche, I know a bit about it, I'm going to delve into it, and I will write for academic publication, and they do a very good job on it, but it's very narrow. And what they then don't do is say, well, let's see, how does this fit into the bigger picture? So I suppose being essentially a journalist, I kept thinking, well, let's put this try and show the totality. And that is why I worked on it. And I mean, the Indian Ocean is a fascinating area because slavery begins long before the Europeans arrive in the Indian Ocean, with Vasco da Gama coming round the Cape of Good Hope, and then the Portuguese arriving. That takes place, but there had been for hundreds of years, particularly the Omanis, went down the coast of Africa, linked up, sometimes consensually, sometimes through violence, with local Swahilis, and they Swahili leaders, and they then traded, and then began trading in slaves as well as everything else. And they began making so much money out of this that they eventually moved the Sultanate of Oman down from Muscat, which I've actually been to, down to Zanzibar. And they established their operations from Zanzibar and then went deep into Africa. And this is one of the things that is also, I found very surprising, and it really challenged everything I knew about it, was that there were only two groups that really were involved in colonization and slavery at the same time. Or sorry, three groups. The first were the Omanis, as I've said, who went deep across Africa. They went so far from the Indian Ocean that they actually came out on the Atlantic in Angola, and they were found in the Kunini area of what is now Namibia. They walked people back over 2 years, sometimes even longer. And it is said that the route, they marched along carrying tusks of ivory, which is the other great commodity, and men and women, were so littered with bodies that you could actually smell the route. They stank. So the Omanis were big slave traders, and they were involved in colonialism of the area. The Portuguese also, both in the Angola and in Mozambique, went deep into the interior and took slaves, and also then established plantations, and the plantations there were worked by slaves. And the third group were the Belgians, with King Leopold, who was, you remember, in the 1880s, was given Central Africa, so to speak, given by the Conference of Berlin. So he takes the center of Africa. But apart from that, there is no colonialism and linkage between the colonizers and slavery. The Portuguese, all the way down West Africa, the Dutch, the British, the French, and all the others, they established little forts along the edge of West Africa. They trade. They make relationships with local rulers. The local African rulers, did the slavery. They then sold them to the Brits or the Portuguese or whoever it was, and then they were taken to colonies. It doesn't absolve us from anything that we were involved in, if you want to see it in those kind of terms. But Britain did not take large chunks of Africa until after the Conference of Berlin in the 1880s. Now, that was 50 or 60 years after slavery had been abolished. So the link between slavery and colonialism is, in most part, a mistake.
Where did the slavery actually begin, and how did it grow within Africa itself then?
Of course, we come up against a problem, which is that in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, there is no written record apart from in Ethiopia. They don't have a written script, so you have to use all sorts of archaeological remains to look for these things, and it's extremely difficult. The one thing that we have certainty of is that on the Nile, you have etchings on the Nile, and I reproduce one of them. The first one on the second cataract of the Nile goes back to 2900 BC, and it shows what were called Nubians, who may have been Sudanese, may have been Ethiopians, who were being brought up the Nile by Egyptians, by the pharaohs, And this went on from 2900 BC, and it continued more or less unbroken until certainly the 19th, early 20th century. So there you have, what, nearly 5,000 years of slavery. And we know that it happened because you can see the record written in the rocks or etched into the rocks. And nobody denies that it took place. And there's a huge record about this, and plenty of writings. And it changes over time, of course. And when the Egyptians are strong, they push southwards on the Nile and they enslave people. And when they are weak, they move backwards and then use the slaves that they have, or try to bargain them and things. So it's a very changeable record. But that's only one example. And if you go to West Africa, there are examples of the gold production in the upper reaches of some of the rivers, like the Niger River. And that was based almost entirely on local farmers and slaves. And then the slaves were gradually traded with local peoples. But when Islam comes to Africa after the death of Muhammad, so about 700 AD or CE, depending on which terminology you use, it spreads first to Egypt. They conquer Egypt. Then it moves all the way along North Africa, and finally then crosses into Portugal and Spain, who are conquered by what are called the Moors then. And they hold it for hundreds of years. And they enslave the people that they conquer and try and convert them to Islam. And there is, of course, this sanction that once they are converted to Islam, they can't become slaves anymore. But I mean, the other thing was, you either put to the sword or you were enslaved. I mean, depending on what the conqueror wanted. And they enslaved people in Portugal and Spain, exported them all the way across the Mediterranean. But they also then began moving southwards, particularly with the Berbers. When the Berbers had become taken to Islam and become Muslims, they then also joined in this, and they moved southwards right across the Sahara into the Sahel area, which borders on the forest belt in West Africa. And they took people north, and sometimes they took salt, gold, sometimes they took slaves. And these were very substantial caravans, could be hundreds of people. The conditions were at least as bad as they were crossing the Atlantic. Sometimes people died of thirst because, of course, wells would dry up or they'd lose their way. At other times, they would be enveloped in sandstorms and entire colonies would die. Sometimes they died of cold because the desert can be extremely cold. And then the boys in particular were taken across, would then be castrated, many of them, to produce eunuchs, and death rates were up to 9 out of 10 boys were died. And the descriptions there are of castration are just unreadable, some of them, and they are really appalling. So this is all happening before 1440 and the first Portuguese taking 6 or 7 slaves, Africans, that they find to slavery. That's the 1440s is when it all begins with the Portuguese. That all begins before all that happens.
Yes, the Portuguese, I think, were even larger than the British in terms of the slaves that they traded, from what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, they took about half of all the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, to be honest with you, they behaved exactly the same way as the Europeans or the Chinese or anybody else did. I mean, everybody, if you beat up the person who lives on the other side of the hill or the mountain, you take them slaves. I mean, the Romans did it, the Greeks did it, the Chinese did it. It's just universal. The abolitionist movement which begins in the 18th century and reaches its climax in the 19th century, was so successful that it became indelibly marked on our consciousness. I mean, it was not just in literature, it was not just in the law, it was in foreign policy. I mean, it became one of the key elements of British foreign policy for 40, 50, 60 years. They would go around to they were instructed, the Foreign Office was instructed to go around to all the local rulers, whether they were in India, Ethiopia, or in Turkey, and say to them, this cannot continue. And it was a key point in all the negotiations when the British Empire was at the height of its power. And that it became sort of etched on our memories.
I remember reading a biography of General Gordon, who was sent to the Sudan because they refused to stop trading in slaves, and he had to go there and force them to do so. And similarly, our Navy has been mentioned many times in books and articles about the way in which it intercepted the transatlantic slave trade. And I think 2,000 sailors or something like that gave their lives in order to try to stop this trade. But we don't seem to celebrate that part of the story.
No, I completely agree. I mean, actually, it was many more. There were two patrols which were sent to both East and West Africa. It began in West Africa and then went to East Africa. Some of them were based in Cape Town, my own hometown, and others then were further off. Some of them were effective, some of them were highly ineffective, but they took, just in the Atlantic, they actually freed about 155,000 African slaves who they took off boats that were being taken across the Atlantic. The numbers in the Indian Ocean were far smaller, the area was much larger, and the dhows were very effective at escaping from them. They took about 12,000, but there were about 17,000 sailors who lost their lives in the Atlantic alone. Now, most of them died from disease, not in battles, but there were plenty who did die in battles. They died from scurvy, they died from malaria, they died from cholera, and all the usual things you would expect in a pretty primitive environment with no antibiotics. So they did pay a high price, and then of course they had to. What do you do with 155,000 Africans that you freed? And they couldn't send them back to the places because most of the people didn't speak English. They couldn't describe where they'd come from. So they established places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and they released the slaves there. Some of them as indentured labor, particularly in the Cape, didn't have a very good life for many years, but eventually it came all right. So it's a very mixed picture. I mean, some of them were left on St. Helena, and there are some very moving examples of people Africans who had been freed, who then wrote back to the people that had released them in St. Helena, saying, "Thank goodness you got me to Nigeria. I'm now being looked after properly. I've got a job. I've been given a job by the British authorities." So it is a very, very mixed picture as to what you find. But overall, the Union Jack was seen as the flag that sets us free.
Which is something we tend to have forgotten today.
We shouldn't.
Surprising. There was an interesting news article only yesterday, which was about Sir Lenny Henry, who has released a book called The Big Payback. And he's making a claim that reparations should be paid to Black people. He's argued that the UK should hand over £18 trillion to Caribbean countries, and also the cash should be given to Black people in this country because, and I quote, "all Black people personally deserve money for the effects of slavery. Can you say something about that? What's your view on that?
It's a difficult one. It's one that I've tried to, shall we say, only look at tangentially, because it is a whole study all by itself. I think the three things one can say about it. First of all, and Lenny Henry is right, that the payments, there were payments made when slaves were freed in the 1830s, 1840s, but they were made exclusively to the slave owners for losing their property. Not a penny was given to slaves. Yeah. And people then point out, oh, we only paid off the loan for this in 2015, which is true, but a complete misunderstanding of why this happened. It was because they were at very low rates of interest, and the Treasury just rolls over low rates of interest debts. It had nothing to do with why it took us so long to do it. Yeah. So that's the first point. Yes, he is right on that. There have been many calculations. There's one which is over 1 quadrillion. I don't even know what a quadrillion really is. I've never come across it, but it's basically
it's more than a trillion anyway.
Yes, it's something like 7.5 times the total gross domestic product of the United States. Some people have claimed that, and they want interest to be added on each year. So you can imagine it's just a rising figure. It's never going to happen. I mean, it's just completely insane that anybody thinks that that's going to happen, in my view. I mean, other people...
But what it does, though, if it never happens, is it still entrenches guilt. Yeah. You haven't paid off what you should have paid.
Absolutely. And the third aspect of that is that the cost that Britain did bear was the one that I've mentioned, which was the Navy, which in a sense was more or less the same order of magnitude that it cost Britain to run the Navy to try and stop the slave trade as it paid the slave owners. So you could argue, if you want to, that we have paid in some way for the freeing of other people's attempts to enslave Africans. But the other thing I would say is, if you really want to take up this issue, then boy, oh boy, let's do it properly. Let me give you 3 examples.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, as I've mentioned, was the great slave trader, going back to the dawn of time. They have lots of money. Let them open their archives. And if we want to talk about this, let's talk about the totality of it. The second thing I would say is, don't forget, there were also British people who were taken as slaves to Africa. There were at least 30,000 who were taken by the Barbary pirates to Africa and enslaved. Some of them were freed eventually in ransom, but the vast majority either died on the galleys that they were rowing, or if they were women, they were put into harems and they became slaves, sexual slaves for people. So, there's got to be a payment. You've got to, if you're going to ask for money for one lot, you've got to ask it for the other. Now, 30,000 is nowhere near the 12.5 million that were taken across the Atlantic, of whom Britain was involved in about 3.5 million. But I mean, in total, the Barbary pirates took 1.5 million Europeans to North Africa. So, you then get into these stupid, I think pointless efforts at, who wants to do this arithmetic? And who would get the money? Where would you pay it to? It's just, I think this is a complete dead end. And the final thing I would say about it is, the most burning issue is not reparations. The most burning issue is slavery in Africa today. There are perhaps as many as 1 million Africans who are held in slavery in Africa, who are either inherited, bought, or sold. And that is the issue that in my view, we should concentrate on.
I want to move on to that as but let me just finish off this bit about the reparations, because the Church of England has put aside, I believe, £100 million, or seeks a fund of that much to pay reparations for its role in the slave trade. And the argument is, and I'm going to quote Lenny Henry again, he said, the reason why black people are overrepresented in prisons today is due to the slave trade. And the reason why Africa is underdeveloped today compared to the West is because of the slave trade. Do you have any comments about those causal links?
Well, I don't. I think that they're weak at best. I mean, we're talking about, if slavery ended in the 1830s in the British Empire. I mean, slavery ends in Britain in 1807. The slave trade ends in 1830s. Then what are we talking about? We're talking 200 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that work? I mean, what is the connection? I think it is extremely difficult to trace these things, and how would you find those linkages? And because the other thing that one has to remember is that if you're going to go back that far, then you also have to say, well, what were the cultural forms that were taken by slaves to the colonies when they didn't arrive, as a blank slate? What did they bring from Africa that was of their own culture? And you can still see it with elements of voodoo, for example. I was in Cuba recently, and that was there. So there are elements that you've taken across. There are elements of African culture in India to this day, with the Siddhis, who were and acknowledged that they were African slaves, at least 100,000 in India, 150,000 in Pakistan. I mean, is India going to have to pay reparations to Africa for importing African slaves? I mean, where do you end? I think this is just insane. You can't go down this road. Now, does this mean we should do nothing? Absolutely not. In my view, what we should do is, first of all, everybody should open their archives, encourage scholars to do the work, wherever it is, whether it's in India, in Arabia, or in Britain. I mean, I don't have any closed archives here. But I mean, if they're private archives, everything should be made available. Secondly, we should digitize as much of it so the people in the Caribbean and whether they live in the Caribbean or they live in India, who have a slave heritage, should have access to this as easily as possible so they understand where they come from. And thirdly, I think there should be elements of monumental, producing monuments and museums in the places where African slaves now live. And I don't really mind whether that is in Cairo or in the Caribbean. People should acknowledge this. It is part of our joint heritage, and we should never forget about it. So I'm not arguing that we sweep this under the carpet, but when you get into money, the sums are insanely huge. Who would pay whom, and who would begin paying people back in the opposite direction? You just don't want to go into that kind of risk.
Okay. What about museums you mentioned, but museums at the present time are tagging lots of works of art and artifacts. The National Trust is doing that, but with comments like this house was owned by people who once invested in sugar plantations, or this picture was once owned by somebody who was trading in slaves. What's your view on that approach to education in our own culture?
I'm all in favor of it. I think it's a good idea. I think we should make the record as accurate and full as possible. However, when I then approached the National Trust some years ago and said to them, look, of course, it's fine what you're doing, but what about your properties which were either near or were part of the areas which were attacked by the Barbary pirates, and all the way along the coast of Devon and Cornwall, and places like Looe, and were closed for weeks because people couldn't go into them. You have a lot of properties where you could actually say this property or this area was attacked by African slavers, and people were taken from here. Oh, they didn't want to hear about this. They completely resisted it. So, I'm sorry, but we should the record should be complete. and we should, encourage people to look at all aspects, whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable.
Well, maintain some balance.
Yeah.
Let's move on to modern day slavery. Bring us up to date, please, with what modern slavery is present in Africa today.
There are at least 5 African states in which people are still enslaved. And I'm not talking about, the tragic situation of what is now called modern slavery, where people are, held captive, their passports are taken away for a period of time, and they're forced to work for extremely low wages or very little at all. I'm talking about people who are actually owned, inherited, traded for the rest of their lives.
Inherited slavery, so the children of slaves are slaves.
Yeah,
That's
so
known as slavery.
that is now in each area you have to look carefully at the anthropology and the culture of each society. So Mauritania is the best known example.
Yeah.
It's been going on for years. There are people who describe themselves as white Mauritanians and those that are black Mauritanians. And they tend to be, the divide tends to be Arab and African. But nobody denies that this has happened. Well, the government has tried to at times, but it's gone on for years and years, and there are many groups that work on this. But this is inherited slavery. You then get places like Niger, where I described a little bit, where the Sokoto Caliphate existed, and there are still people there who have an enslaved relationship with people, and people are bought and sold. And one exceptionally brave woman took her case all the way up to a West African court and finally got permission to, get some recompense and be freed from her master. The other places are Mali. A UN rapporteur reported 2 years ago that there were 200,000 people who lived under the control of their master. And then the 2 other major areas are Sudan, which I'm afraid has been enslaved by Arabs since the beginning of time. And I mean, I have met people who said, if we didn't walk across the width of Sudan, when it was one country before it was divided between North and South, we would have been killed by the Arabs.
You've met people who
I met them, yes. And they said we had to, as boys, we got about 20, 25 boys, and we just walked. We walked to where the sun rose. And some of us were eaten by hyenas, some of us died of snake bites, some of us starved to death. But the most of us got there, and then we fought with the North. Against the North.
Yeah.
And then you get Libya, where people are pouring out of countries like Eritrea, Ethiopia, other West African countries to try and come across the Mediterranean. And if they can pay, they can get on a boat, and the smugglers take them. But the majority run out of money, certainly large numbers, and then they're held in these camps. And
I believe there were slave markets in
slave markets.
Libya.
Yeah, and CNN did a marvelous piece of work and broadcast it, and it was shocking. People were being bought, sold, as day laborers. And the really shocking element about all of this is that the African Union and the Arab did one evacuation from Libya. Apart from that, I don't think they've done anything. They don't want to talk about it. And the Arab League, which has 11 members in Africa, doesn't want to talk about it either. In fact, they never discuss African slavery, despite having been some of the largest enslavers.
Yeah. I think that even takes place, from what I've heard, in relatively developed African countries. In the north of Nigeria, I believe there's slavery as well, to some extent.
I'm sure that's true. The other thing that's really shocking is the sort of cultural heritage, and I'm just beginning to do some work on that. In Ethiopia, there is a tradition that if you want to marry somebody in the highlands, they will have an investigation to see whether there's any element of slavery going back generations. in your partner's ancestry. And if there is, you will not be married.
But there's very little work being done to alleviate that. And if the Church of England, it seemed to me, anyway, my own personal view is if they do raise £100 million for reparations for slavery, I don't think they could do better than spending it on alleviating modern slavery. That would be some way of making a positive contribution there.
I completely agree. I think that if they could help doing that, would be wonderful. But of course, I'm sure the 100 million is only a drop in the bucket for what people say they owe.
Well, as I say, Lenny Henry wants 18 trillion, but I've got one last question, and thank you very much for your time. We've come to the end of our talk, but in reevaluating slavery, I think your book does an excellent job of contextualizing slavery in that way. It doesn't just focus, as many books do, on one small narrow element, but places that within the context of a much bigger picture, and therefore gives you a much clearer idea of where we are. But today, you point out there are a number of myths which we labor under within the West. I think you list 4 myths which we've got here. They assume that slavery is exclusively imposed from outside Africa, that they conflate slavery with colonialism, that we treat transatlantic slavery as the only form of African slavery, and we believe that slavery ended in the 19th century, when none of those things are true. But in schools and in educational institutions, we teach a lot to our children about slavery, and much of that contains these myths which have been put together. What needs to be corrected, in your view, in terms of informing the younger generation and our own children about the situation about slavery, and how would you go about making any changes, or what changes would you suggest for that?
Well, I think that we have to, perhaps begin at the intellectual level, which is, and this would take some courage, which is to say to Lenny Henry, listen, you're just not looking at the totality, and you're taking on these arguments. And I think that's beginning to happen. I mean, there's been a very good book recently about slavery in the Islamic world, and other.
I think I've got that one. Yeah.
Yeah, other people are bringing out other books. So I think there's beginning to be a bit of a turning of the tide. But I think I'm sure that most teachers haven't the faintest idea about any of this. And that is really why I wrote this book, was to try to say to people, look, I'm not doing original research. All the research that I've quoted, I didn't go to archives and look for it. I looked for it in the most obvious place, which was the British Library. And it was all available to me mostly within 70 minutes. I could find all of this material, and there are pages of footnotes that I've provided. People can check them out, and I hope that I will be challenged and people point out mistakes, because for sure I have made mistakes. You can't write a history of 5,000 years without errors and omissions. So I would be happy to, if people don't like the argument, well, that's their business. But if they point out that I've made a mistake, of course I would be sorry, and I would try to get that rectified. But
and if there was one lesson that you'd want to teach the children today in schools, what would that be?
Be inquisitive, be curious, question, and when you find a question that you are interested in, hang on to it and keep working at it.
Martin Plaut, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
It's a pleasure.